Today, we are starting a new sermon series entitled My Imperfect Family. Um, I can tell you exactly where the origin and idea for this sermon series came from. I was scrolling through social media one day, and as I went through the different people's stories, there was a people that had a picture there of them as a couple, and about how they had such a happy marriage was the caption. There was another one where there was people there with their kids and how they had such a great family. And there was another one that posted a picture about they were out living their best life. And uh, the problem is I'm a pastor and I knew the rest of the story. I knew that everything that they were posting was a total facade, that it was all, we're putting our best foot forward and we're not going to talk about what's going on back here. I mean, I understand that's the nature of social media, is that we're going to put the best out there for everybody to see. And most often, we don't ever talk about the imperfect things. We don't publicize them, we don't put them to the front, and we don't want to deal with them. And I want to do for this sermon series is talk about some of the things maybe that we don't say to our spouse and don't say to other people. And today we're going to start with the topic of marriage in a sermon entitled, What Was I Thinking? Okay? And again, I kind of know the origin of all of these different things that come to my mind. It was a few days before my wedding, and my friend Rusty said, I'm going to give you some advice that his friend Jim, a mutual friend, who'd been married about 7-8 years, gave me. He said, Jim set me down a couple days before my wedding, and I'm going to do that for you. And he said, Jim set me down. He said, you know, when you get to the church that day and you get on your tux and you're ready to go to the front, and you see the pastor standing up there all ready to do the sermon, he said, I just want you to do is run as far, as fast as you possibly can. And the reason most of us find that humorous is because we were married for a few months and we went, oh boy, what was I thinking? I mean, my spouse brought in all of this childhood trauma that they'd kept hidden from me. They brought in some major mood swings that I wasn't prepared for. And I mean, there's some anger there. We got into it and we asked, what was I thinking? And it's not just a thing that happens once in our marriage. It usually happens at the end of year 1. It happens in year 7. It happens in year 15. Happens in year 25. Where you go, what was I thinking? How did I get here? Well, to answer that question, we're going to go back to the beginning. Not back to the beginning of your relationship, although that would probably answer a lot of questions. But we're going to go back to the very beginning, to Genesis, to chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1, we get this aerial view of all of creation. Here's what happens in the days. It happens very fast. We're just getting to look down and see the landscape. When we get to chapter 2 now, we're going to focus in on day number 6. Chapter 2 is going to take us to the day that man was created. And all the way along, God has been creating and saying it's good, it's good, it's good. And for the first time, he says something different. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. It's not good for man to be alone. He needs a helper. And before you get sidetracked, ladies, by the word helper, you need to know that that word there particularly is used 26 times in the Old Testament. 16 of those is a reference to God having to help man. So it's not a statement of weakness. It's a statement sometimes we're going to have someone who's strong enough to come in and save the day. We need a helper for him. So to underline this point now, Adam is told to name all of the animals. All right, and I kind of picture it like this. Adam sits down and up walk this male and female deer, and he looks at them, and there's a buck and a doe. And then up comes the turkeys, and he says, you know, there's a tom and there's a hen. I don't really care about anything that was named after that at all. Maybe some of you do. But anyway, so they're all coming up, male, female, all look different. All different. And at the end of the naming of the animals, there's another line given, and no suitable helper was found. It was underlined. There is no creature in all of creation that can meet the needs of man and fill his void in his heart. No creature, no matter what we tell ourselves. So Adam falls into his deep sleep. God removes a rib and he makes a new creation. And in verse 23 of Genesis 2, it says this: the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." So now we have man, woman, male, female, and then we get an aside statement. We get a statement that's directed specifically for us, not for Adam and Eve. It's added in there, as Moses writes this down from God. It says, "This is why a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." This is why. This becomes our foundational statement about marriage. It will be quoted by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19. It'll be quoted by Paul in Ephesians 5. It's used repeatedly and over again as the foundation by which we understand marriage. And I want to say just three things today that tie from these verses that I hope are helpful to you. The first one is that marriage is the closest of human relationships. Marriage is the closest of human relationships. It starts off verse 24 with this statement: "This is why." Now, depending on what translation you have, it says maybe start with the word therefore. When Jesus quotes it in Greek, he says, "For this reason." The NIV does more of a little bit of interpretation than they do just specific translation. It's drawing upon what was just said. We've had something said, we're now going to draw a conclusion. Well, what was just said? What was just said is, "This is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones." Now, that seems like a little bit of a throwaway statement, but scholars tell us that's actually an ancient description of family. We might say this: "They're my flesh and blood." That's what this verse is summarizing. And so in this is this statement that now husband and wife are the closest of human relations beyond any family. Let's just pause for a second and ask that question. Is your spouse closer than your family? Is it your closest, relative? Now, he spells out exactly what that's going to mean. For this reason, because there's this close relation, there's going to have to be leaving. They're going to have to leave your home, your father and mother, and then start this new relationship. You're going to go from your closest relationship, your parents, to your new closest relationship is your spouse. It is the highest of human relationships. For years, I did lots of wedding ceremonies. I tried to do all kinds of things. There was days back when I was in Iowa, I was doing 2 and 3 weddings on a Saturday, and I tried to be creative and write some. Basically, what I ended up landing on is I'm just going to walk everyone through their vows. Okay, and the vows always start the same. I take you to be my wedded wife. I take you to be my wedded husband. Or do you take this person to be your wedded wife and your wedded husband? And when I walk through those, I stop and I say, right there, we start off with this is a declaration that you are now willing to step and take responsibility into a new relationship that is the highest of all. Before this time, you've been friends, you've been dating, you've been exclusive, you've been engaged and fiance. Now you move to a new level. And the rest of the vows do is they spell out, the privileges and the responsibilities. This is what you're going to get, and this is what you're going to give in this relationship. It's a relationship that brings you together. Now, with that statement, there are 2 implications we have to realize. The first one implication is for parents. The first one is for parents. You are going to have to allow your children to leave. That sounds easy, but it is not. And in fact, it goes sometimes against every instinct that you have. But you're going to have to allow them to leave. One of the top killers of marriage is the in-laws. I sat with a couple doing counseling. It was sort of informal. Jonathan and Amy and they were having problems with his parents. And at the time, the show Everybody Loves Raymond was really popular. If you've ever seen Everybody Loves Raymond, Amy says to me, she goes, in the show, Frank and Marie coming over all the time and being overly involved in their marriage, well, it's funny. But in real life, it's not funny. It's destructive. Parents have to be willing to let their children leave. On the other side is children, you have to be willing to leave your parents. You have to be willing to cut those strings and move away. And again, it sounds so easy, but it's not. Another counseling session many, many years ago. I'll never forget this. We were talking about the in-laws, same problem. I say it's a marriage killer. And he said, and I quote, well, the thing is, I can always get a new wife. I can't get a new family. And they ended in divorce. And I think it started right there. I get those are two extremes. Those are two extremes. Your family's butting in all the time, and on the other side, you've got people who are overly committed to their family. Most of us live somewhere in the middle where family issues are just one decision at a time. And you make certain decisions that drive your spouse crazy because you're making them more about your parents than about them. And your parents are making more decisions, and you're letting them. I get an email from Mark Driscoll. He's a preacher out in Arizona. I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but there's some gold that comes through occasionally. And he had one a few months ago. His child was getting married. And he said, I do the same process with all of my children. This was his second one to get married, I believe. And he said, I set them down and I said, listen, you are making a new family. Do not think that you are joining our family. You are making a new family. And your number one priority is to each other. So what that means is when you take vacation, don't plan it around us. Don't plan vacation based on us. That means when you have birthdays, your priority should be each other. Make new traditions around that. When it comes to the holidays, your first question should not be, how do I make my family happy? It should be, how do we make each other happy? You are not joining a family. You are making a family. For this reason, a man will leave father and mother and form a new bond, a new relationship. Second thing in this passage is that marriage connects us in unity. Marriage connects us in unity. Back to 2:24. This is why a man will leave his father and mother and is united to his wife. There's this sense of unity. The word can be translated cling to his wife, cleave to his wife. That's one I don't use very often. Hold fast to his wife. There's this bond that is formed. And it's hard sometimes to figure it all out. I recognize when I see it, okay? You've seen it too, probably. I'm sitting in the living room having a conversation with the man. They've been married a long time. She's in the kitchen working on the meal. And as he starts to tell a story, he eventually yells out, Betty, was it 15 or 20 years ago? She goes, 15. How did she even know what he was talking about? It's because at a certain point, they're so united, it almost seems like they're sharing one mind, right? How do you get there? How do you get it there? Well, first, it comes with a marriage commitment. The words united to his wife are actually a description of making a marriage commitment. To stand up and declare, I love this person and I am going to spend the rest of my life with them. And I have to say that is God's idea. But I also want you to know that in our culture, we pushed back from that. We've said, well, let's just live together for a period of time. Okay? I'll give you my really strong maybe. And he says, no, it's united to your wife. You stand up in front of other people and you make a promise that we call vows. And you declare it. And it's God's idea that you're going to be united. And I know our culture pushes back at this, and I've heard this argument so many times. I've heard things about, well, it's just a piece of paper. We're married in our eyes. I said, really? A piece of paper. There's a group of kids who are going to graduate next weekend, and to them, when they're handed that piece of paper, it's way more than a piece of paper. My son, next Saturday, graduates from college. I'm going to tell you, that piece of paper was expensive. Your title to your car is a piece of paper. The deed to your house is a piece of paper. If you don't think paper means anything, please write me a large check. It's just a piece of paper that represents other little pieces of paper, right? Paper carries with it meaning and significance, and a marriage license is the same. God says you're to be united, but it's not just about a declaration of love. It's about a deeper commitment that's going to exist between the two of you, that you're going to continue to strive to be united in all areas. Now, this is not a Christian reference, but I want to give you something that I think will be helpful to you. I ran across this a few years ago when I was doing marriage stuff. There's a guy named John Gottman, Gottman. He wrote this book. I'll give you some of the background story. He was married and divorced. His now current wife married and divorced. When they got married many years ago, they said they wanted to figure out why the first ones fell apart. They wanted to figure out why some marriages worked. And so they committed themselves to clinical research and formed what is now called the Gottman Institute. And it is all about marriage. And their marriage stuff, like I say, while it's not Christian, is stellar, and lots of great things that they put together to try to help marriages through the Gottman Institute. One of the things they talk about is this topic of what brings you together as one. And I'm going to give you two of the suggestions that they have, and two of the things you need to process. The first one is called bids for connection. That your spouse comes to you and has continual bids for connection. When they say things like, you know what, we ought to go out this Friday, or we ought to go out this weekend, they're asking you to connect with them that way. When they say to you, did you see what happened up in Kansas City this weekend? They want to start a conversation with you. When she says, you know what my sister had to say when I talked to her on the phone today? She wants to start a conversation. Going, I don't care, is not a proper response. Because what happens is you're rejecting their bid for connection. And in a sense, you're rejecting them. And as a spouse, what they found is the more you reject your spouse, every time they begin to ask those questions, eventually they reach the conclusion that I can never make a connection with them. I need someone else to make that connection for me. Instead of bringing you together, it pulls you apart. So whenever your spouse brings up those little things, maybe they drive you crazy, maybe those conversations are not always comfortable, but they're asking you to connect to me to be one. The other thing they talk about is love maps. Love maps. Imagine your heart is like a city. Your heart and soul is like a city. In a city, you've got different areas, okay? You know, you've got, over here's the food district, and over here's where you go for entertainment, and here's where you go for shopping. And to find all those, you need a map, something that points you to the right directions. Well, your heart and soul is kind of the same way. There are things in your life. These are what bring me pleasure and joy. These are the things that make me laugh. These are the things that hurt me. These are different parts of my life. And what you have to do throughout the course of a marriage is build a love map. Now, you did this, though you married people, when you first got together. You made mental notes about, you know what? They don't like this food, so we're not going to go there. They don't like this restaurant. They don't like this movie. They do like this. They really like this kind of food. They really like this kind of movie. They really like these people. You built a map of their life. Now, here's the follow-up question. Have you changed since the day you got married? As you change, your love map changes. And what most of us typically do is when we got married, we go, I've got her all mapped out. I've got him all mapped out. And we just kind of say, now I'll go back over to my friends. And you have to have a commitment that says, I'm going to try to discover these things. I'm going to have to engage in conversation. You need to have 10 to 15 minutes a day, at least 90 minutes a week, in which you're discussing things about your life and that bring you closer together in unity. Now, I'm going to give you one thing. I know from where your seats, you're not going to be able to see this completely, but I'm going to show you anyway. I have on my phone, I downloaded just recently from the Gottman Institute. It's called Card Decks. It's a free app, all right? It was free when I downloaded it. All right, it's a free app called Card Decks. And you click on it, and it pulls up, says Gottman Card Next, and on there's all these different things. If you click on them, up in the top left corner, Love Maps. And it's just going to ask you some questions for you and your spouse to process. What was your partner wearing when you first met? Some of you laughed. Well, what's your partner's favorite musical group, composer, or instrument? Name your partner's two closest friends. Do you know your spouse that well? And there's other different ones here. There's dating questions and stuff that you can do. There's sex questions. Some of that may interest some of you. There's ones labeled salsa, hot, spicy kind of questions about your marriage, listening questions. There's all kinds of things you could do. But what you're doing in that conversation is you're building a map to your partner's heart and to find the places that are meaningful to them. Because for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, and they will be united, joined together. And then the last part of this is this, and the two will become one. Marriage provides for intimacy. Marriage provides for intimacy. A man will be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Within the marriage, God says, I'm going to do is have you be joined together physically. It was God's grand idea to give this to us. Now, there's lots of things we could say about this today, and there's a lot of time we could spend there. I want to underline two things. One, hear this. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united, wife, one flesh. One man, one woman, united in marriage, then they consummate. By that declaration, it eliminates all other possibilities. Man, woman, married together sexually. All other possibilities. Do you hear what I'm saying? In fact, the Bible declares anything that's outside of those boundaries is called sexual immorality. I don't care how you slice it. Jesus will reaffirm this in Matthew 19. It'll be reaffirmed by Paul in Ephesians chapter 5. They always go back to this verse. This is how God created it. And you can try to step outside of that. Husband, a man, woman, united in marriage, having sex. That's what God gave it to us. Now, he explains in this passage of Genesis 1 and 2 partially why this is given to us. It's not just a pleasure thing. In chapter 1, he says, you're going to be fruitful and multiply. The reason I'm doing this is so that you can procreate. I'm going to give you this. It will bring with you pleasure, but ultimately it will bring with you reproduction. I am a father of 4. The Lord has blessed me with 3 really good kids. It's never the same 3. It's always changing. One of them has to do something. But that's the idea, that you're going to then raise a family and they will be able to go out and create their own new families. So he gives you the opportunity and the way to do that. But there is something more that is going on in the sexual experience. And this is not from the Genesis 2 passage. This is actually from Jesus. Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 is asked about divorce. And as he's asked about divorce, he goes back to in the beginning. Okay, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife. And then he says this in verse 6. So they are no longer 2, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. For this reason, be united, become one flesh. That's the sexual act. But then catch the next line. What God has joined together. Not what the state has brought together, not what the church has brought together, not what your family has brought together, not what you have brought together. When you engage in intimacy with one another, you are connecting on a spiritual level. God is bringing you together. He is doing something that's hard to explain. He's bringing you together in a unique and meaningful way, and that person carries part of your heart. Now, maybe that has some idea behind it of love languages. That's how some of us feel love, that we're feeling connected, but maybe it's way beyond that. Maybe there's a spiritual thing that God is doing that's bringing you together. He's molding you into one. I've used this illustration before. Two pieces of construction paper, and you glue them together. When you're done gluing them together, you try to pull them apart. All it does is leaves little fragments on each piece. You can't ever pull them back apart. When you try to separate them, they are so together that the strands and the bonds now are left behind. That's his reasoning why you shouldn't get divorced. But ultimately, it demonstrates for us, though, the power of what God has brought together. That you now are a couple joined, both physically and spiritually. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. The two will become one flesh. God says in the beginning, this is what marriage is about. And despite the warnings, and despite the things we've seen, many of us went out and we got married anyway. And you wonder some days, what was I thinking? Here's what I think you were thinking. I want all the good stuff, but I don't want to have to work to get it. I want all the upside. I want all the good things. But you know what? That relationship with my parents, that's really tricky. I don't know if I want to work through that. Being one, spending time talking, like in depth about my feelings, I'll pass on that. Intimacy, okay, I'm up for that. We wanted all the good, but we weren't willing to work to get it. My hope is that as you look at God's creation and plan, you will see that it is worth the work. Joy Davidman met C.S. Lewis in 1952. They struck up a friendship and they started writing back and forth letters across the ocean. She lived in the United States. He lived in England. They started writing back and forth. He was enthralled with her mind, he said. Over time, she would move to England and she would spend some time there. Now they didn't have to write. They could spend time face to face discussing and talking things out with each other. But her visa was set to expire and she was going to have to move back. And she threw out an idea, what if we got married? A committed bachelor throughout his life said, okay. And they were married. It started off great. It wasn't but a few months into their marriage where it was discovered that she had cancer. It would quickly ravage her body. And it would take only a short time for it to overtake completely. The day she lay on her deathbed that she was going to pass, she made several statements about things. The next to last one, as it's recorded, not her final words, but right before her final words, she called C.S. to her side, called him Jack. Everyone called him Jack. Jack. And she looked him in the eyes and said, I want you to know, you have made me happy. My hope is that at the end of your life, you can look in the eyes of your spouse and say without a doubt, you have made me happy. Let's pray. Father God, I realize in this room there are people on all different levels. There are people who are not even thinking about marriage. God, I pray that you'd guide them into the future where you want them to be. There are those who are dating, and I pray that you would guide them to the right person. There are those here, God, who are engaged, and I pray that you'd surround them with people to encourage them and comfort and strengthen them on this journey. There are people here who are newly married, and they're beginning to wonder what was they thinking, and this is a lot harder. And I pray that you'd surround them with support, that you'd give them encouragement, that this week that there would be things to continue to direct them towards your will. God, there have been people who've been married for years, and it's difficult every day. And I pray that you'd encourage them and put people in their lives that would continue to point them to right direction and stay committed, that they would put in the time and the energy themselves to make great things happen. God, there's some who've been here married a long time. I pray that we would look up to them, that you would allow them to finish their marriage strong. And we can see them as people who are deeply committed to one another and build a lasting relationship, and that they will then in turn pour out their heart into the next generation. God, wherever we are in this room, I pray that you would help to build the marriages in this church to be Christ-like. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.